The Ukrainian people are being attacked from the air, from artillery, from ground troops and tanks. The debris of this war litters every street. But the government has warned for days of Russian saboteurs who've infiltrated the country to bring terror. Death squads who are attacking civilians in their cars as they flee. They do exist, as we found out.
Oh! That's a tyre, isn't it?
Oh, that's a bullet.
That was a bullet.
Sorry?
No, it wasn't a bullet.
It wasn't. Something blew up under us.
Something went bang.
Okay.
Oh, there's a big fuck off hole.
Okay. Oh,
Whoa!
Good.
wait.
Whoa! Whoa! What the f? Whoa! 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 Stop! Where the f is everyone?
Yeah.
Where is everyone?
Here.
Stop!
We think it's a Ukrainian checkpoint and a mistake, so we identify ourselves.
British journalists! Journalists!
Journalists!
Journalista!
Can anyone? You alright, Stu?
Journalista!
Fix it.
Hang on.
Is everyone okay? You okay, Dom?
Yeah, I'm okay. Journalists!
Somehow we have to get out of this, but the rounds keep coming. It's a professional ambush.
Ow.
The bullets just don't miss.
Whoa!
Where can we go? Shall I crawl? Can we crawl down the embankment?
Andre! Whoa! Whoa! No! Stop! Stop! Journalist! Journalist!
Can you make it unhit?
Hey? Where are you
I'm
going?
hit, but escape the car, and with producer Dominic van Heerden, we make our way down the embankment.
Where are
Camera operator Richie Mockler has taken 2 rounds to his body armour, but is still stuck in the car.
Where are they? Where are you guys? Guys! Where are you?
He runs for it in a hail of bullets.
Okay, guys. Keep going.
Stuart. Go on, Stuart, I'm rolling.
The 5 of us have made it out of the car, down the embankment, and we just can't believe we're alive.
Okay, guys, well done, everyone.
I think I'm hit.
Okay, yeah.
Where?
Shook. I can't. I definitely took something in the back of my plate.
Yeah, he is his.
Okay,
Do you have your mid-top?
it's in the car. Let's get out of here. Stuart, can you keep going?
Just wait, let's see what's not major.
I want it.
Second.
Yes, but I think we need to get out of here.
Me too, right.
Guys, just hold it there.
Stuart.
Right. Don't know what's behind you, right?
Yeah.
You've got cover here at the moment, you're not under fire. It's just
We've been ambushed.
Do you have your phone?
We come on a big fire. My car's destroyed.
I don't have a phone.
We've lost everything.
My phone.
I think I've been hit. I think I've been hit.
Anybody got a phone?
No,
Yes.
we're all in the car. Yes, I have.
Stuart,
You
wait.
have to have one.
No,
Okay. We're not sure what we're going to do now. We have to try and get into some cover, but it's really, really dangerous here. And
it doesn't matter. If we just
hope and see if we can get out. I've certainly been hit with something, but we need to get back up to those cops. So you're bleeding from the head as well.
All right, Stuart.
Before these guys follow up, we need to get out. Okay, let's go. You're bleeding from the head.
Stuart,
Let's go through there, behind that wall.
Well, that is a pretty sobering way to start this event, but I'm Mark Austin and welcome to the launch of Reporting the War in Ukraine, a book with contributions from journalists with first-hand experience of covering the war from the front line, a war in Europe that frankly I never thought I would witness again after the conflict in Bosnia, but it is happening, it is awful, and of course it needs to be covered, and it is dangerous, as Stuart Ramsay and his team can testify. And Stuart joins us now. And frankly, Stuart, I wonder, first of all, how you all survived that. It must have been terrifying.
It was terrifying, and I really don't know how we survived it. I actually have been back quite recently and looked at our car, which is in a pound where lots of other cars that were also attacked by Russian forces have been sort of lumped together. And there are hundreds of rounds into our car and other vehicles as well that families were travelling in, and tanks have driven over cars, and lots of people have died on this bit of motorway that we were on, the M06 and the E40, they're big highways pretty much across Europe. And I think what was really important about what I've written in the book, but in our story generally, is that what was not exceptional was the fact that civilian cars are being attacked in this way. What was exceptional is that Richie Mockler, our cameraman, filmed it all, which obviously gave us this incredible insight as to what was happening. And Mark, one thing that is really important, and I know everyone here today at this book launch, in one way or another, covers wars, and we all know how dangerous they are. What has become clear to us, having spoken to the police and investigators, is that actually this wasn't just a case of being caught up in a war where a bomb may or may not go off, that there may be strafing bullets, etc. We seem to be the victims of an actual crime, which was not to attack journalists, because they couldn't have known we were journalists, but to attack civilians, to bring terror, and to effectively control that highway which leads into the west of Kyiv. And that is something that has been something playing on my mind, because this isn't like many wars that I've covered, because this was very specific. As I say, it is actually a crime, as opposed to being hurt or even killed in wars which many of our colleagues have had to suffer as well, as we know. But this seems to me slightly different.
Yeah, and I'm just interested to know whether, with hindsight, you would have done anything differently. What would you have done differently? You mentioned unmarked civilian cars. Would you have marked? I'm not clear. Did you have markings on your car? Would you have put markings on your car with hindsight?
No, because Mark, you were there at the time. If you recall, the government was saying that the saboteur groups were driving around Kyiv in cars marked with press, and we know that other colleagues of ours were pulled out at gunpoint on a number of occasions. The advice given to us by their media operations was actually to not put media signs on the car, but to approach checkpoints slowly and to have your accreditation. So that's why we've chosen not to identify ourselves in this particular instance. What would I have done differently? Probably nothing, because we'd already made a good decision by trying to get to Butcher. Now, of course, nobody knew Butcher in those days. We do now. But we'd got to a point where it was so clearly so dangerous. There was so much activity, so much fighting going on. Front lines kept changing constantly. Even the Ukrainian soldiers had no idea where the Russians were at any given time. So we had called it a day. We were actually heading back and took guidance from the police to drive down that road. Now, he did not know what was happening on that road, but the Russians had already moved in. And so this was an ambush. It's so different to other
aspects of war coverage that we have all done. It's because, I mean, we're in a soft skins car. It's clearly a family saloon. One would argue you're not a danger to anyone. And we couldn't see it coming because, by definition, it was an ambush. So there was something specifically different about this attack that you normally encounter during war.
And you say it was an ambush. It's pretty clear it was an ambush. But do you know it was the Russians? Have the police managed to, or the military in Ukraine, have they managed to give you any more information about that?
Oh, yeah, they're absolutely convinced. They have a mapping themselves. They've got logs of where they know Russians ended up. Now, they didn't know they were there at that stage. But what happened in the coming days, we were one of the first to be attacked in this way, but there were dozens and dozens of others that were attacked on exactly this road for the next sort of 2 or 3 weeks while the Russians were trying to find their way into Kyiv. Now, the Ukrainians had already blown the bridge, which was why, because they knew that there were Russians attempting to go that way, but they didn't realize that there were groups that are already advanced towards Kyiv. And one other thing I would say is that we'd spent some days, I mean, I'd been there for 2 months before this happened, by the way, but we'd been through checkpoints many, many times. The Ukrainian checkpoints, by and large, were not awfully sophisticated. Carrying out an ambush like that, where most of the rounds didn't miss the car, it suggests professional soldiers, and the Ukrainians were not shooting at each other.
Now, Stuart, you've been back since. I wonder why it was so important for you to do that. Why did you want to go back after what happened to you?
I think because we want to carry on reporting on the war. We think all of us as a team. We didn't all go back together, by the way. Myself and my producer, Dominique Van Heerden, went back with 2 other members of the Sky teams. But we felt it was important to get back. We felt that we want to carry on covering this story and this incredible war that, like you, never thought I'd actually see. It was important, though, to go back. I think to get back on the horse, there is an element of that. I think quite a lot of people in the management, quite a lot of colleagues that I met when we were out there were surprised that we walked through the door of the hotel, etc., and all found us in the battlefield in the east. But it was important to go back. And we will continue to do so. And do you know why? It's quite simple, really. We do have to tell this story. People are certainly, everyone who's going to be here today knows that's their job, but it's also to a degree a vocation. And I suppose, without getting, too highfalutin, I actually do want to go and bear witness to these things. And it was important to continue doing so.
Okay, Stuart, thank you very much indeed. And I'm very glad it goes without saying that you and your team are safe. But it is, of course, a big decision to send teams to a war zone, send teams like Stuart's team. So let's hear from the boss whose ultimate responsibility it is to make those sort of decisions, John Ryley, head of Sky News. And he started by giving his reaction to hearing what had happened.
It was day 5 of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. It was a Monday afternoon, and I will always remember that afternoon. I was sitting in a room here, and the head of international news, Tim Sinclair, knocked on the door and said, "John, I need a word. We've got a problem with the Ramsay team." And it was apparent very quickly that they were in serious trouble, that they'd come under fire from Russian snipers about 20k out of Kiev, and that they had yet to reach safety. And what ensued was a very nasty, unpleasant 22 hours.
In the chapter, you say that when you first saw the actual video of the attack, you felt sick. Can you expand on that?
Yes, I mean, I'm one of those decision takers who sits in a cosy office in West London and signs off on risk assessments. And I always sort of slightly hesitate when I sign off them. And as many of you will know listening to this, a hostile environment is a Category 5 risk assessment. And I signed it for the Ramsay team. And then when I actually saw what they'd gone through, I thought, oh, that was very unpleasant and nasty indeed. But I do think it's important that the public see what journalists endure and risk their lives for, to witness what is going on and witness what totalitarian governments are doing.
You talk about those hours in the chapter between when you hear a team is in serious trouble and when you hear that the situation is resolved. Give us a sense of what it's like in those hours as head of a news organisation.
It's difficult. I mean, I believe passionately in the need to go and witness what's going on in the world, whether it be something peaceful or something very nasty and hostile, but it comes at a cost. So I had a very unpleasant night that Monday night. You don't sleep very much. Every time your telephone pings, you think, is this something to do with the Ramsay team? But you just have to sort of get on top of your nerves and hope for the best. They all got out, all 5 of them, thanks to their training. They followed their training and they were calm under severe pressure. But as well, they were lucky.
You talk as well about loneliness. You talk about a sense of loneliness of sort of being at the top and having ultimately to take responsibility for what's going to happen to that team.
Decisions should always be, discussed with your team, your senior team of people. But ultimately, if you're the boss of a news organisation, sometimes you have to make a difficult call. It may not be popular, it may be difficult, but ultimately, a single person in very tricky circumstances, such as this, has to make the decision. And that's hard sometimes.
In the hours that followed, there was lively, you say punchy debate about how much should be shown of this footage. How did that debate unfold and resolve itself?
So we all sort of got in a room more than once. Those of you who work in news will know that people like me spend a lot of time in meetings talking about stuff, the ethical issues and all that. They can go on a bit. Some people like to talk a lot. Some people like to say very little. It was punchy. Some people thought we shouldn't show it. Some people thought we should show more than we did. There's a cut and thrust. And again, ultimately, I have to make the decision. And on this occasion, I went into the edit suite and cut the 4.5-minute piece that went out on the Friday evening.
Early on in the chapter, you mentioned Mick Dean, the Sky News cameraman shot and killed in Cairo in 2013. How much do you think what's happened to him has informed subsequent decisions you've made on deployments, and do you think what happened to Stuart Ramsay's team may affect decisions on deployments that you make?
Sadly, I learnt a huge amount when Mick Dean, a very lovely man, was shot dead in August 2013. How the need to sort of just, when a very big crisis happens with your own people, just to pause and reflect and think through the consequences of your decisions and your actions and really slow everything down, which is not in the nature of a non-stop news organisation. And there have, of course, been look at the procedures that were followed by the Ramsay team in Ukraine, back in Ukraine, and we learned from those and putting those changes into place. Particularly the need, actually, to have a mobile phone with you at all times, on you, not left in the car.
Why finally is it right? Why is it important that your correspondents continue to risk their lives where necessary?
It's absolutely important in this uncertain, dangerous world, far more dangerous than when I was a child, that proper journalists, trained journalists, go out and bear witness to what is going on in the world. Because if we don't do that, the world won't hear about it, and democracy ultimately will suffer.
John Ryley, head of Sky News there. So let's speak now to the man whose job it is to keep teams safe once they're in Ukraine. Mark Grant is the head of security at Sky News. Hi, Mark. Now, you were in Ukraine when this happened. So are there any lessons to be learned? Did they do anything wrong? Was it bad luck? Was it wrong place, wrong time? Give us a sense of your impressions of what happened.
Yeah, I think the first thing to note is that these deployments actually are planned months in advance with regards to risk frameworks that are in place. So we had Stuart Ramsay's team, who are probably one of the most experienced teams I've worked with. So regarding how they deployed, it couldn't be done any better. Regarding lessons learned, as John mentioned, there is a lot of lessons which could be learned on the tactical level and things we're already implementing. But as a whole, I felt that the deployment that they went on, they communicated effectively, they were experienced, and they reacted based on what they've seen on the ground. There were so many variables involved in that incident that I think everybody can say they're extremely lucky to still be here. I think in other circumstances, a less experienced team, it may have been slightly different. But again, the outcome was the outcome. There is lessons to be learned, is something we're looking at internally and across industry, not just from this incident, but across the conflict as a whole. This has been the most kinetic and dangerous conflict that I've been involved with, And speaking to my peers and other news organisations, they say exactly the same. For the first time in a long time, we have not been on this reporting from the side of strength, which has ultimately increased the risk to teams on the ground. So yeah, there are lessons to be made, Mark, but it'll take time and slow progress.
What makes it a more dangerous war in your view than, say, Bosnia or Iraq or Afghanistan? What is it about this conflict?
I think from a journalist perspective, it's the scale, it's the large scale of this conflict, and arguably it's the first non-asymmetrical war we've fought in the last two decades. And like I mentioned, we are no longer reporting from the side of strength as we did in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think the other thing to note is the speed at which things were changing on the ground even before the conflict started. There was I think it was Stuart who mentioned the issue with accreditations, curfews, and the fact that the National Defence were armed with 20,000 weapons in the early days created this air of tension on the Ukrainian side, which again impacted how we operated as journalists on the ground in the early days of this conflict. I think the other thing which is quite unique about this conflict in itself is the amount of information available. And I'm sure you can remember, Mark, right at the start of the conflict, we had some analysts predicting that nothing would happen. And on the right of arc of that, some were predicting that Kiev would be surrounded in 2 days. That makes it very challenging from a planning perspective. And when we're looking at contingency planning and emergency evacuations, that information really does create barriers to having things in place for teams. We were changing our plans in the early days on almost a daily, if not hourly basis.
Yeah, well, points well made. Mark, thank you very much indeed. Now, obviously, it's not just Sky News teams reporting out there. All the main broadcasters have deployed several different teams to Ukraine. We'll talk to a few journalists now who have been there and reported from the front line, starting with Alex Thomson, a veteran war reporter who has covered 20 or more conflicts for Channel 4 News.
Anatoly had explained how his friend Olena and her husband, both civilians, were shot on the streets of Trostianets. Olena's husband escaped wounded. Her body lay in the street, he said, for 5 days. The town mayor, Yuri Bova, examining one of many burnt-out pieces of Russian armour scattered around this place.
In my estimation, approximately 50 people have been tortured to death or murdered. But this number is only based on the information we have now. We found dead people in a cellar, beaten, with black eyes, with their hands tied behind them so tight it cut into them.
He can list case after case after case of civilians killed here during the 30 days of Russian occupation. The number grows daily as people return here and discover the bodies and the graves. Of course, potential war crimes may not simply be the killing of civilians. There is the deliberate targeting of civilian installations, not least hospitals. They were rightly proud here of the newly refurbished hospital on the edge of town. But now the place stands empty, severely damaged by more than 30 tank shells fired into it. Somehow, someone filmed at least some of it, a Russian tank firing repeatedly at the hospital. The mayor says Russian soldiers were billeted in this building here before the attack. Now we know that they were certainly in the vicinity because their uniforms still with the red armbands lying on the ground there. The tank is still in position, the barrel trained on the newly refurbished hospital. The mayor says just before the attack, a senior Russian officer went in, did a tour of the hospital and congratulated them on the place. And then the attack began. He says around 30 tank shells fired into the building, and he is categoric. There was no military presence in the hospital whatsoever.
And hopefully we can join Alex now. And Alex, I read your chapter in the book, and you speak very clearly about the importance of logistics. And by that, I mean local drivers, local translators, and local fixers.
Yeah, we're completely dependent upon them, obviously for driving the Ukrainian style, but also language know-how, and also they have obviously a complete stateless. This is their country, their war. They have an incredible passion, in my experience, to get the story out. It's a very unusual war to cover, in my experience. I'm not sure I'd agree it's the most dangerous one. It's very kinetic, but it's also very cut off. It's very hard to get to in many ways. The Ukrainians have complete control. By the same token, there's no particular danger of being kidnapped, like Afghanistan. So I think, the assessment, I would take issue whether it's a particularly dangerous war. It's particularly dangerous in certain parts when you go to them. But those are very, very demarcated, as we all know.
And you talk also in the chapter about the nature of the war in Ukraine, and you use a very interesting phrase. You say, the fact is, in Europe in the 21st century, Ukraine is us, you say, in a startling and brutal new way so few of us ever thought possible. And does that, determine the way you go about covering it?
Yeah, it does, and it's really amazed me the kind of the pitch it's had. I live in a small village in the middle of nowhere, but get home and people are putting up Ukrainian flags and indeed putting up Ukrainian families. I mean, I covered 6 or 7 years of war, much nearer home, right in the center of Europe, and in many ways more violent. I mean, Srebrenica, the Serbs killed 8,000 men and boys over 2 days. We made a big fuss about what was happening in Bucha and areas around Kiev, which was bad. It was awful. But look at the kind of howl around of war crimes, which that caused around the world against what happened with something like Srebrenica. We kind of got short memories in some ways here, but yeah, I mean, we've all grown up. You called me rather nasty a veteran just there, Mark. But we've all grown up with this world order where one man, and let's face it, it is men, can't start wars like this. Can't happen. Doesn't happen. That all went out with the Second World War, and then League of Nations, United Nations, different dispensation, Cold War, blah blah blah. It's all been torn up, and I think that's really hit people hard.
Okay, the young Alex Thomson, thanks very much indeed for that perspective. And BBC News also, of course, has a huge presence in Ukraine. One of those faces is Orca Guerin, who has been reporting from Ukraine on and off, it seems to me, for several weeks.
Close. Max speed.
We're told to drive at maximum speed on the exposed road to Lysychansk. A dark horizon greets us. Residents praying for salvation as Russia lays waste. Ukrainian troops call for help to take away one more victim of Russian shelling. Nearby, the rush to evacuate civilians who have to duck for cover. A panicked departure in an armoured truck.
Well, people are taking this chance to get out while they can, but they know this could be a one-way journey. If the Russians take this territory, and they're getting closer all the time, these people may never be able to come back to their city and their homes.
The situation is critical, a rescue worker says. Can't you hear the shelling? So another city empties out, here in eastern Ukraine. A few more wait anxiously for their turn, hoping to outrun moving front lines. Volodymyr is among them. He's sick and headed to hospital. He tells me that life here was calm until the war broke everything apart. And it has left its terrible mark. This was the Palace of Culture, now standing as grim testament to Moscow's superior firepower. Ukraine's president says Lysychansk is already dead, along with neighbouring Severodonetsk, ghost cities now.
Well, this is an example of the kind of devastation that Russia has brought. It's not just destroying apartment buildings and flats and homes, it's destroying history and the fabric of cities. And this is a deliberate tactic: bomb, shell, burn, and leave nothing but scorched earth.
And Orla is with us. And Orla, I've always admired your reporting for the way that your stories, as we saw then, seem to be less about soldiers and the fighting and more about the people caught up in this, caught up in the middle of it. Is that important to you?
Can you hear me?
Yep, got you. Yeah, did you hear the question?
Thank you. Yes, I did. Thanks, Mark. And thanks for the kind words. I mean, I think it has to be a mix of both. I don't think you can tell the story of a war without being on front lines or trying to get to front lines. I think what many of us have found in covering this war is that we were actually on the second line or the third line, because as has been mentioned, the Ukrainians kept tight control and are continuing to keep tight control of access to frontline areas. We did spend time with frontline troops. I think there are human stories there too. Many of the men who are now fighting and the very young men who are now fighting had very different lives just a few months ago. We've met people who were lawyers, teachers, nurses, who volunteered to take up arms when Russia invaded Ukraine, and who now find themselves standing in trenches, fighting a war that I think none of us imagined we would see in our lifetimes. And many of them who are fighting and dying are very young. One of those who was killed while we were there just recently was 22 years old. He had got married just last month on his birthday. He left the front line, went back to Kyiv, got married at the age of 22, and was killed 5 days later. And he was undoubtedly one of those, the bright young generation of educated Ukrainians who would have been helping to rebuild their country after the war. So I think there is human loss on the front lines as well. But I also feel, you know, to borrow a line from the great Martha Gellhorn, war happens to people one by one. And I think sometimes in our reporting, when we're looking at large numbers, you know, tens of thousands in trapped cities, millions having to flee, that can have the effect of distancing the audience. It can feel overwhelming. It can feel impersonal. I think when there is a chance to look at individuals, at individual families, then that often makes the stories, I hope, more resonant. I think it helps the audience to understand. I think it helps people to identify with the situation and consider how it would be if it was them. You know, how would it be if it was you who was told you had 10 minutes to pack up and go, if you had to reduce your whole life to what you could carry away with you, and if you had to run for your life with your children under your arms.
Yeah, and I think we should say at this point that journalists choose to go to these conflicts. Civilians, and many of the civilians we cover, cannot escape in many cases. They are trapped there, and we should make that point. But we are talking about journalists and journalism. And you say, just finally, Orla, in your chapter in the book, you say this: there is no unthinkable now. Is that the way you feel about this war? And why did you, briefly, if you could, why did you say that?
Yeah, I do. I think I'm from a generation that kind of came of age in journalism in the post-Cold War world. And in fact, one of my first assignments was for RTE in 1990, going to Moscow to cover what turned out to be the last ever Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. And it was a very chaotic, very uncertain time, but it was also a time of hope and possibility. And there was a sense that, you know, the great tectonic plates had moved, and that we were in an era that was more safe and more stable. And we certainly didn't need to worry about a threat from Russia anymore. I think post the 24th of February, in a way that is frightening for us all bets are off. We can no longer take for granted anything about European security. We have to consider that Russia invaded Ukraine and it might go further. I think it is a new era of instability, a new era of risk, a new era of danger. It's also a new era of economic consequences for us all, which will be felt very keenly this autumn. But I think that things have changed in ways none of us could have imagined, and absolutely for the worst.
Orla, thank you for joining us today. Now, there is another layer of coverage going on, of course, the longer form coverage journalism. Paul Kenyon has done, I think it's 3 panoramas from Ukraine. I hope I'm right. Half hours rather than 5 minutes, of course. Let's have a quick look.
Three months into the Ukraine war, and evidence of Russian atrocities is mounting.
They beat me for an hour until blood was coming out of my mouth.
After the Russian withdrawal from the suburbs of Kyiv, we hear the stories of the civilians murdered in cold blood.
A bullet hit Ivan in the head as he sat in the back seat.
Now, the soldiers that terrorized Kyiv are threatening towns in the east. Residents are being forced to flee.
It's pure horror, never stops.
I would say there are thousands of perpetrators at the ground level and scores of perpetrators at the higher level.
Tonight on Panorama, the hunt for Putin's war criminals. The invasion of northern Kyiv as seen through the eyes of Russian soldiers, filming themselves in expectation of a swift victory. They fanned out across Hostomel Airport, a strategic staging post into the capital.
Машины, скажи, чтобы машины не трогали, людей гражданских не трогали.
Those orders were soon ignored. I was here the day war broke out, and by chance filmed some of those Russian soldiers as they advanced into the city.
This guy's got a gun in front of him. Okay. Is he pointing at me? Just...
3 months on, the scars they inflicted remain.
And let's talk to Paul Kenyon, who compiled those reports for Panorama. Hi, Paul. First of all, is there a benefit in having more time to do your half hours, more time on the ground, I mean, rather than having to do nightly or, in some cases, hourly reports?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I look at people like Orla and some of the others, and they are what we would call tied to the camera, aren't they? So they're in a position where throughout the day they're trying to meet a deadline. They've got to get there. They've got to get the new material on air. We're in a position where we can spend a little bit more time. We can go to places which perhaps others couldn't reach, in the sense that we can do it terribly long journeys and know that we'll be off grid for 2 or 3 days, but know what our destination is and know that we're going to get something that nobody else has. The downside of it slightly is that we operate outside in a sort of semi-detached way from the core, in my case, from the BBC. So away from the BBC machine. In some ways that's good, because you can perhaps take more risks or do things which you don't have to keep reporting your every movement. On the other hand, when things do go wrong, sometimes you do feel as though you are slightly separated from the rest of the team. So you feel as though you can kind of go it along, and you feel as though there's a sort of there's a path which not many others have trodden, which you can take, which is all extremely useful. I mean, one of the problems also, though, is that when you find somebody in this very raw state who is going to give you information, details, intelligence, which nobody else has been able to give you, you know, we have the immediate problem of how we care for them afterwards, of whether we show their faces, of how we protect them.
Is there a danger too, Paul, in you would be tempted to push things because you need to get something more than the nightly news program, something special in a sense.
Yeah, there is. There is always that, isn't there? And you know, you end up in situations where, I remember my producer last time we were there, we're in Donbass and we're in Slavyansk, and it was quite noisy. We went as close as we could to the front. And the question you keep asking yourself, which feels terrible, as I say, in the cold light of day, but have we taken enough risk? Did we risk enough? Did we push it far enough? How can we measure that? How can we, and the danger is in a way that you start measuring it against what happens in the news that evening, which is quite a destructive thing in a way, because that sort of magnifies, if you like, some of the dangerous moments and some of the drama. And we need perhaps to be slightly more nuanced in the way that we go searching for material. And we can tell stories, obviously, in a far deeper, a more nuanced and perhaps thoughtful way. So that is a luxury, and that is something that we don't take for granted. We are very fortunate to have.
All right, Paul, thank you very much indeed. Now, I covered wars for a number of years for ITV News. They have a great commitment to covering these difficult stories, and one of the correspondents covering Ukraine for them at the moment is Rohit Kachroo, their global security editor.
It's not just in the streets, but from in the woods of Donbass where the battle is being fought. They're running out of rockets, and the launchers are older than Alexandra or any of his men.
These artillery systems have 16th rocket. They 1986 years old.
And as light fades, the command comes in to fire. These are some of the longest range rockets their army has.
2
minutes? 2 minutes. The rockets are aimed at the places from where they think Ukrainian towns are being attacked. Then we move before Russia's armed forces have the chance to reply. It's not just people being killed, it's places too. The fight is for cities like Lysychansk, which is being erased before the eyes of those who chose to stay. This is the latest destruction, but not the last. Listen here for the sound of the whistle, then the bang.
That's us.
Oh yeah. Train coming. Yep. We're leaving, and quickly. That explosion was nearby. The reason there's no commotion is that there's almost no one here. Then, outside our car, another blast.
Incoming? Yeah, it's behind us.
Yeah. We spot a plume of smoke rising. It's another residential building which has just been hit a few hundred meters from where we were standing. And this is why what's left of life has moved underground, where it's nighttime all the time, and where everyone has their reason for why they haven't left. For Valentina, it's because she didn't want to be a burden on her young family.
I've spent my whole life here. Why should I leave my own home? Grandmothers are praying. We are afraid because we are just human. We get scared.
Back beneath the trees, Alexandra's unit are thinking of their families too. The seasons have changed twice since the invasion began. It's now hot, the soldiers are weary, and they're missing home.
Last see my son 21st February 22.
3 days before the invasion.
Yes, yes.
In another field, another rocket launcher is sent in to strike against the Russian units behind attacks like the one we saw with our own eyes. The missiles disappear, then the soldiers too. But nothing is happening rapidly in this war of attrition. Rohit Kachroo, ITV News, Donbass.
How do we do it? How does it feel? Well, I mean, how we do it is with a great deal of caution, a huge amount of caution. I mean, I think people probably don't realize at home um, how much risk we are actually avoiding when we go into these theaters of war. And how we do it is firstly with a great deal of training, and secondly with a great deal of trust in our colleagues. I mean, one of the interesting things about this assignment compared to some of the other big stories which have dominated the news over the last 5 or 6 years, you know, Brexit, politics, elections, is that really when an assigning editor is putting their team together for this, they have to think about much more than those basic editorial considerations. They've got to think about, you know, people who understand each other, people who know each other, people who can work together, and most importantly, people who will do the right thing and be collegiate if the worst happens, if something really bad happens. And I think that was a consideration, not only for our head of news gathering, our director of foreign news, but for their equivalents right across the television news industry, because this is really dangerous stuff. And one of the interesting things is that most organizations have lost their organizational memory of how to cover stories like this. And because, you know, the Arab Spring was several years ago, and since then our news has been dominated really by politics, by covering summits, by the process of leaving the European Union, by covering Donald Trump's presidency. These are the stories that have dominated news. And, you know, it takes a lot of thought, assignments like this. It takes a lot of planning. And actually, it requires us all to think about our colleagues in a very different way to the way that we've gotten used to thinking about our colleagues. You know, when your fellow correspondents or producers or camera operators are just people who you meet at the Eurostar terminal to head over to Brussels to cover a summit, well, that's a very different work relationship to one where you are together entering a war situation and eventually heading up to the front line. So how do we do it? Well, with a great deal of thought. There is a huge amount of risk. But you know, we have all been drawing on each other's experiences, not just within our own organizations, but across the organizations. I think one of the interesting things about this story has been the extent to which news organizations have worked together. You know, I ran into Stuart Ramsay at Heathrow Airport the other day, who was going on holiday, and I was going to America on an assignment, and you know, we had half an hour there where we just sort of almost debriefed amongst us and kind of shared our own experiences. And, you know, I took Stuart's advice about where I should be going and where I shouldn't be going. And, you know, I think this entire community it benefits from having, you know, really knowledgeable operators, experienced people who've done this all over the world, who are willing not just to sort of keep their information, their knowledge for themselves, but who recognize that for the good of the general coverage of the story, that their experience, that their wisdom should be shared too with people who might in other circumstances be considered rival news organizations.
Rohit Kachroo there. Now, we've been concentrating, of course, on television coverage of this war, and like it or not, modern wars are played out largely on television. The immediacy of 24-hour news has an impact, and in fact, television coverage can, on occasions, change the course of a conflict. But Jim White is a distinguished print journalist who has been looking at the television coverage and the impact of that coverage.
Well, I think the old cliche about if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, did it really fall, applies to the news. If a television camera isn't there and it's not on the news at 10, did it really happen? It is absolutely at the current heart of the Ukraine story. When it started, the war, when Putin first sent his troops in there back in February, it dominated the news agenda. Clive Mair was on top of a building in Kiev reporting every night about the horrors of the war. And gradually, as other things have happened, as the war has continued, it slipped down the agenda. It barely gets now more than a short mention at the end. And for Ukraine, this is critically important that it does remain visible, because that's how they get their weapons, because news develops the agenda back in the countries that are watching it. And what Ukraine needs is for all of us to be alarmed about the war, to be putting pressure on our politicians to get something done, and principally to send weapons to Ukraine. And if it's not on the news, we're not doing that. And Zelensky is very, very good at getting himself into the TV news, very good at presentation. And every time he does, he says something like, the only way we're going to win this war for you is if you send us weapons. He knows that, and he needs the war to still be up the agenda. And it's very, very hard at the moment to get it in, because everything else is happening in the world, and it kind of drags on in Ukraine.
Yeah, Jim White there, and the key is that broadcasters stay committed to this war in Ukraine. There we are. That is the launch event for this book. It's well worth a read. There's much more than TV coverage. It also looks at cyber war and propaganda war, and it examines the Chinese and Russian roles in all this. The book, there it is. You can see it, Reporting the War in Ukraine. The first draft of history is available on Amazon in all the different formats. So thank you for watching. We will leave you with a reminder of the very real dangers faced by journalists in a war zone. Bye-bye.
The Ukrainian people are being attacked from the air, from artillery, from ground troops and tanks. The debris of this war litters every street. But the government has warned for days of Russian saboteurs who've infiltrated the country to bring terror. Death squads who are attacking civilians in their cars as they flee. They do exist, as we found out.
Oh, that's a tyre, isn't it?
Oh, that's a bullet.
That was a bullet. Right?
No, it wasn't a bullet.
It wasn't. Something blew up under us.
Something went bang. Oh, there's a big fuck off hole.
Okay. Oh,
What?
Whoa! Whoa! What the f***? Whoa, whoa, whoa! Whoa! Stop! Where the f*** is everyone?
Yeah.
Where is everyone?
Here.
Stop!
We think it's a Ukrainian checkpoint and a mistake, so we identify ourselves.
British journalists! Journalists!
Journalists!
Journalista!
Can anyone... You alright, Stu?
Journalista!
I think so.
Hang on.
Is everyone okay? You okay, Dom?
Yeah, I'm okay. Journalists!
Somehow we have to get out of this, but the rounds keep coming. It's a professional ambush.
Ow.
The bullets just don't miss.
Whoa!
Where can we go? Shall I crawl? Can we crawl down the embankment?
Andre! Whoa!